Wyoming Territory, 1885. The silence of the high plains was a language Caleb Blackwood understood better than any other. It spoke in the sigh of the wind across the bunchgrass, in the distant cry of a red-tailed hawk circling on a thermal, and in the steady, rhythmic creak of the leather saddle beneath him. For 6 years, this silence had been his only trusted companion, a stark and empty cathedral where he worshipped the god of self-reliance. His ranch, a sprawling tract of hard-won land nestled against the foothills of the Laramie Mountains, was more fortress than home, a bulwark built of solitude and fenced with the sharp wire of memory. From his vantage point on the ridge, he could see the whole of it. The low-slung ranch house, the sturdy barn, the corrals like geometric scars on the earth, and the silver ribbon of Willow Creek that gave it all life. It was his kingdom, and he was its solitary king. He was a man carved from the same unforgiving landscape he inhabited. At 34, his face was a testament to sun and wind, with lines etched around his eyes that spoke of long distances squinted over. His hair was the color of dark earth, and his eyes held the cool, distant gray of a winter sky. He had built this life with his own 2 hands, nail by nail, fence post by fence post, after the old one had burned to ash. The war had taken his youth, and the fever had taken a rest. Sarah. The name was a ghost on his tongue, a phantom ache in his chest that had long ago settled into a dull, permanent throb. He rarely spoke her name, even in the privacy of his own mind, but her absence was a constant presence, the quiet center around which his lonely world revolved. He had learned the bitter lesson that attachment was a vulnerability, a crack in the armor through which loss could deliver its fatal blow. A man survived alone. That was the first and last commandment in his scripture of survival. His gaze drifted east toward the thin, ruled line of the horizon where the Union Pacific tracks cut across the sagebrush flats. He did not need to check the silver watch in his waistcoat pocket to know the time. He could feel it in the angle of the sun, in the quality of the light that turned the dust motes into a swirling, golden haze. The afternoon train was due. It was an event that meant little to him, a noisy intrusion of the outside world that he preferred to keep at a distance. It brought mail he seldom received, supplies he could procure himself, and strangers whose business was not his own. It was a disruption, a twice-weekly reminder of a life he had deliberately left behind. Then he heard it, not the rumble at first, but the whistle, a long, mournful cry that carried for miles on the clear, dry air. It was a sound of arrival, of change, a thing alien to the steady, unchanging rhythm of his days. It echoed off the stony faces of the mountains and seemed to settle in the valley below, a summons from a world of steam and steel and crowded cities. Caleb's horse, Apollo, shifted its weight, its ears twitching toward the sound. Caleb placed a calming hand on the powerful neck, his own expression unreadable. For him, the train whistle was not a promise of connection, but a harbinger of complication. He had his work, his land, his silence. It was all a man needed. It was all a man could safely possess. He turned his horse away from the ridge, intending to ride back toward the barn, back to the familiar solace of his routine. But something made him pause. A flicker of movement, a disturbance in the pattern. He looked back toward the distant smudge of dust that was the town of Redemption. The train was arriving, and with it, a disruption he could not yet name, a change carried on that mournful sound, destined to shatter the deliberate, painstaking peace of his solitude. The train hissed to a stop at the Redemption Depot, its great iron lungs sighing a plume of white steam that momentarily obscured the raw, unpainted wood of the platform. For Eleanor Vance, the sound was the final punctuation mark on a journey that had felt less like a passage and more like a slow, rattling erasure of her entire world. She had traveled for 5 days, leaving the soot-stained brick and civilized clamor of Boston behind, watching as the lush greens of the East bled into the endless, sun-baked browns and ochres of the West. Now, stepping down from the carriage, her hand clutching a small, tapestry-covered valise, she felt as though she had disembarked on a different planet. The air was thin and dry, carrying the scent of dust and something wild and resinous, like pine. The sun was a physical weight, a relentless pressure that made the fine wool of her traveling suit feel like an instrument of torture. She stood for a moment, a solitary figure of deep blue against the town's palette of dust and weathered gray wood. Her honey-blonde hair was pinned in a neat chignon, but stray tendrils had escaped, clinging to her damp neck. Her face, pale from the long confinement of the train, was smudged with a faint trace of soot near her temple. She was 24, an orphan with no prospects, and this journey, this town, this unknown man she was to marry, represented the entirety of her hope. She scanned the small crowd on the platform. There were a few rough-looking men in dusty hats, a woman with 2 small children, the station master with his official-looking cap. But there was no one who looked like Mr. Abernathy. In his letters, he had described himself as a man of some standing, a merchant with a prosperous future. He had promised a comfortable home, a new life. He had promised to be there, waiting, with a kind smile and a steady arm. But the platform was emptying, the greetings and reunions dissolving into the general murmur of the town. A wagon creaked away, its wheels grinding in the thick dust. The station master was busy unloading crates. No one looked at her. No one was waiting for her. A cold knot of fear, which had been a small, tight thing in her stomach for the entire journey, began to uncoil, spreading its icy tendrils through her chest. From the far end of Redemption's single, dusty main street, Caleb had watched the train arrive. He had come into town for a sack of flour and a new strap for his bridle. A necessary errand he always timed to avoid the brief chaos of the depot. He stood outside the mercantile, a tall, quiet shadow leaning against a support post, observing the scene with a detached, practiced stillness. He saw the usual assortment of arrivals and departures, the familiar faces of his neighbors. And then he saw her. She was as out of place as a porcelain teacup in a blacksmith shop. Her clothes were too fine, her posture too refined, her whole being radiating an aura of Eastern civility that was utterly alien to this rough-hewn world. He saw the expectant hope in her expression slowly curdle into confusion, and then into a quiet, dignified panic. He knew that look. He had seen it before on the faces of newcomers who had been promised a paradise and found only dust and hardship. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. She approached the station master, a harried man with a drooping mustache. "Excuse me, sir," she began, her voice sounding thin and reedy in the open air. "I am looking for a Mr. Abernathy. He was to meet me here." The man paused, wiping a sleeve across his sweaty brow. He squinted at her. "Abernathy? Can't say I know the name. You sure you got the right town, miss?" "This is Redemption, is it not?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "It is," he confirmed, before turning back to a heavy crate. "But there ain't no Abernathy here. Not that I've heard of." The world seemed to tilt beneath Eleanor's feet. The heat, the exhaustion of the journey, the crushing weight of this final, devastating disappointment, all converged in a dizzying rush. The edges of her vision began to blur, the dusty street dissolving into a shimmering haze. The station master's words echoed in a cavernous space inside her head. No Abernathy here. She had come all this way for a man who did not exist. She was alone, utterly and completely alone. The valise slipped from her grasp, landing with a soft thud in the dust. The world went dark. Caleb saw her sway. He had already started moving before he was consciously aware of his decision. His ingrained instinct to avoid entanglement warred with a deeper, more primal instinct to protect. He saw the paleness of her face, the way her eyes lost their focus. He closed the distance in 3 long strides, his boots silent in the deep dust. He reached her just as her knees gave way, catching her in his arms as she fell. For a moment, she was a weightless bundle of fine wool and bewildering lavender scent against his chest. Her head lolled against his shoulder, a stray pin releasing a cascade of honey-blonde hair that brushed against his jaw. The contact was a shock, a sudden and unwelcome intimacy that sent a jolt through his carefully guarded defenses. He held her, surrounded by the indifferent bustle of the town, a woman from another world who had just collapsed into his. The silence he had so carefully cultivated was broken, not by a sound, but by the fragile, human weight of a stranger in his arms. The first thing Eleanor became aware of was the scent of leather and dust, and something else, something clean and masculine like fresh-cut pine. The second was the feeling of being held by arms that were as strong and unyielding as oak. She blinked, her vision slowly clearing. The face above her was lean and weathered, framed by dark hair, with eyes the color of a storm-tossed sea. A stranger. She was in a stranger's arms. A mortified gasp escaped her lips, and she struggled to sit up, pushing against a chest that felt as solid as a rock wall. "Easy now," a low voice rumbled, the sound vibrating through her. "You fainted." Caleb helped her to a nearby bench, his touch impersonal and brief, yet she felt the warmth of it linger on her arm. He retrieved her valise, dusting it off with a large, calloused hand before setting it beside her. He stood back then, creating a respectful distance, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression guarded. He looked like a man who regretted his own decent impulse. "Thank you," Eleanor murmured, her cheeks burning with humiliation. I don't know what came over me. The sun is strong here," he said, his tone flat and practical. "And you're a long way from home." It was a statement, not a question. He had already surmised the broad strokes of her story. It was a common enough tale in the West. A woman promised a new life. Arriving to find the promise was as empty as the landscape. The station master, his duty finally pricking his conscience, ambled over with a tin cup of water. "Here you are, miss. Best to drink this." Eleanor took it with a grateful nod, the cool liquid a balm to her parched throat. The reality of her situation was beginning to settle in, cold and heavy as a stone. She was stranded in a strange town, with little money and no one to turn to. The man she was supposed to marry was a fiction, a cruel joke played on her desperation. "Is there a hotel?" she asked, her voice regaining some of its strength. She would not fall apart. Her father had been a scholar, but he had taught her that resilience was a form of intelligence, too. "The Redemption House, down the street," the station master said, jerking a thumb over his shoulder. "Ain't much, but it's a roof." Caleb's jaw tightened. He knew the Redemption House. It was a saloon with a few grimy rooms upstairs, a place frequented by drifters and rough ranch hands. It was no place for a woman like her. He thought of his own home, of the quiet, clean spare room, of Martha, his housekeeper, a kind and sturdy woman who would know what to do. The thought was an intrusion, a complication he immediately tried to dismiss. It was not his problem. He had his own life, his own ghosts. He did not need to invite another person's troubles into his sanctuary. He turned to leave. He gave her a curt nod. "Good day, miss." He had done his duty. He had caught her when she fell. That was enough. But as he walked away, he heard her voice, clear and steady despite the tremor of fear he could sense beneath it. "Sir? Mister?" He stopped, his back still to her. "Blackwood," he said without turning. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, standing up. "I know I have no right to ask, but is there any work to be had in this town? A governess, perhaps? A seamstress? Anything at all?" The quiet desperation in her question was a hook that caught in him, pulling him back against his will. He turned slowly, taking in the sight of her. She stood tall, her chin lifted, her eyes a startling shade of deep violet blue. He now noticed, meeting his directly. She was frightened, but she was not defeated. There was a core of steel beneath the fine wool and lace. He saw a flicker of another woman, another time. Sarah had possessed that same quiet strength. The memory was a painful twist in his gut. He thought of Silas Croft, the land baron who had been trying to buy him out for a year, a man whose greed was as vast as the territory. He thought of the rough men Croft employed, men who frequented the Redemption House. Leaving this woman to fend for herself, there felt like leaving a lamb at the mercy of wolves. It went against a code of honor he did not even realize he still possessed. His solitude was a choice, but his decency, it seemed, was an instinct. With a sigh that seemed to come from the very depths of his soul, a sigh of resignation to a fate he had not chosen, he spoke. "The hotel is no place for you," he said, his voice rough. "My housekeeper, Martha, could use some help at the ranch. It's not what you're used to. The work is hard, but it's clean and it's safe." He paused, his gray eyes locking onto hers. "You can stay there until you've made other arrangements." Eleanor stared at him, stunned. This stern, silent man was offering her a lifeline. She saw no pity in his eyes, only a reluctant, almost grudging sense of responsibility. It was an offer born of duty, not kindness, and for that, she was strangely grateful. Pity would have undone her. Duty, she could accept. I don't know how to thank you, Mr. Blackwood." "Don't thank me," he said, his tone clipped. He gestured toward a sturdy wagon parked near the mercantile. "The ranch is a few miles out of town. We should leave before it gets dark." He was already turning away, his long strides eating up the ground, a man eager to get this unwelcome business over with. Eleanor picked up her valise, her heart a confusing mix of terror and a fragile, burgeoning sense of hope. She followed the silent stranger, leaving the depot and her shattered plans behind in the dust, heading toward an unknown future in the heart of the wilderness. The journey to the ranch was made in a silence that was thick and heavy with unspoken thoughts. The wagon wheels crunched over the dry earth, and the only other sounds were the jingle of the harness and the occasional snort from the horses. Eleanor sat stiffly on the hard wooden bench, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the vast, intimidating landscape unfolding around her. The mountains loomed in the distance, their peaks turning purple in the late afternoon light. The land was beautiful, she realized, but it was a harsh, unforgiving kind of beauty, one that seemed indifferent to human frailty. Caleb Blackwood sat beside her, a study in stoic stillness. He handled the reins with an easy, practiced competence, his attention on the trail ahead. He did not speak, did not look at her. She felt like a piece of cargo he was reluctantly transporting. She stole glances at his profile, the strong line of his jaw, the unyielding set of his mouth. Who was this man who had rescued her? What sorrow or hardship had carved such a formidable wall of reserve around him? She felt an inexplicable urge to ask, to breach the silence. But the formidable quiet he projected was a clear and effective deterrent. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and crimson, they crested a small rise. Below them, nestled in a valley carved by a winding creek, was the ranch. It was a simple, functional place, a long, low house made of timber and stone, a large barn, and a series of corrals. Smoke curled lazily from a stone chimney, a welcoming plume against the deepening twilight. For the first time since she had stepped off the train, Eleanor felt a flicker of something that resembled peace. A woman came out onto the porch as they pulled up, wiping her hands on an apron. She was stout and gray-haired, with a kind, weathered face and intelligent eyes. This had to be Martha. "Caleb," she said, her voice warm but with a note of surprise as she took in Eleanor. "I wasn't expecting you back so soon." Or with company, Caleb swung down from the wagon, his movements economical and precise. "Martha, this is Miss Vance. She's in need of a place to stay. I told her she could help you out here for a while." He delivered the information as if it were a report on fence repairs, devoid of any social pleasantry. He then turned his attention to unhitching the horses, his part in the introduction apparently complete. Martha's gaze softened as she looked at Eleanor, taking in the fine but travel-worn dress and the exhaustion etched on her face. She came down the steps, her expression one of gentle welcome. "Well, any friend of Caleb's is welcome here. Though he has so few, they're a rare sight indeed. Come on in, child. You look like you're about to fall over." The inside of the house was a revelation. It was simple, rustic, with heavy wooden furniture and a large stone fireplace that dominated the main room. But it was also impeccably clean and filled with a surprising warmth. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting a golden glow on the polished wood floors. The air smelled of wood smoke, baking bread, and dried lavender. It felt like a home, a sanctuary. Over a simple but delicious supper of beef stew and fresh bread, the silence was less oppressive. Martha filled it with a gentle, running commentary on the goings-on of the ranch, asking Eleanor simple questions about her journey that required no painful explanations. Caleb ate with a focused intensity, contributing little to the conversation beyond a monosyllabic answer when directly addressed. Yet, Eleanor felt his presence acutely. He sat at the head of the table, a solid, grounding force in the room. She found herself watching his hands as he ate, large, capable, callous from hard work. The same hands that had caught her when she fell. Later, as Martha showed her to a small, simple room with a comfortable-looking bed and a handmade quilt, Eleanor finally felt the dam of her composure begin to crack. The kindness of this stranger, the warmth of this house, after the utter desolation of her afternoon, was almost too much to bear. "It's not much," Martha said, smoothing the quilt. "But it's clean and quiet. It's more than I could have hoped for," Eleanor whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "Thank you. I don't know what I would have done." Martha placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. There, child. No need for tears. You're safe here. Caleb, he doesn't say much. He's built his walls high, but there's a good man behind them. He wouldn't have brought you here if there wasn't." That night, tucked into the clean, lavender-scented sheets, Eleanor listened to the sounds of the ranch. The wind whispering around the eaves of the house, the distant lowing of cattle, the soft stamp of a horse in the corral. They were lonely sounds, but they were sounds of life, of a place that was real and solid. She thought of Caleb Blackwood, the man who had offered her this refuge. He was a puzzle, a fortress of man, and though she was a guest in his home, she felt as if she were still miles away from understanding him. Sleep finally came, a dreamless blackness that offered a temporary reprieve from a world that had been turned completely upside down. The days that followed settled into a quiet routine. Eleanor, true to her word, proved to be a willing and surprisingly adept helper for Martha. Though she had never done a day of physical labor in her life, she learned quickly. She learned to knead bread, her soft hands growing stronger. She learned to mend clothes, her fine needlepoint skills translating easily to patching sturdy work shirts. She collected eggs from the hen house, her initial trepidation around the chickens giving way to a fond familiarity. The work was grounding, the simple, repetitive tasks a balm to her frayed nerves. It left her blessedly tired at the end of the day, with little time to dwell on the ruin of her plans. She saw Caleb mostly at mealtimes. He would come in from the fields or the far pastures, his face streaked with dust, his presence filling the kitchen. He would wash at the basin on the porch, the sound of splashing water a signal of his return. At the table, he remained a man of few words, but Eleanor began to notice small things. The way his eyes would soften almost imperceptibly when Martha told a funny story. The gentle way he handled the stray cat that had adopted the barn. The quiet gratitude in his nod when she refilled his coffee cup. He was like a man living behind a thick pane of glass. She could see him, but she could not reach him. Her own transformation was subtle but profound. The Wyoming sun kissed her pale skin with a healthy glow. The hard work added a new resilience to her slender frame. She began to trade her impractical Eastern dresses for simpler, more functional skirts and blouses borrowed from Martha's trunk. She started to feel a sense of belonging, not to a person, but to the land itself. She found a strange beauty in the stark landscape, in a vast, open sky that seemed to stretch on into infinity. She was no longer the delicate, helpless woman who had fainted on the depot platform. She was discovering a strength within herself she had never known she possessed. One evening, a week after her arrival, a storm rolled in from the mountains. The sky turned a bruised, purple-gray, and the wind howled like a hungry wolf. Rain lashed against the windows, and the world outside was reduced to a churning chaos of wind and water. The storm had forced Caleb inside early. After supper, Martha retired to her room with her mending, leaving Eleanor and Caleb alone in the main room, lit only by the flickering firelight. The silence between them was different tonight. It was not the tense, awkward silence of strangers, but something more companionable, made intimate by the storm raging outside. Eleanor sat in a rocking chair, a book open in her lap, though she was not reading. Caleb was cleaning a rifle at the table, his movements methodical and sure. The scent of gun oil mingled with the smell of the fire. Finally, Eleanor found the courage to speak the question that had been on her mind. "Mr. Blackwood," she began softly, "why did you help me?" He did not look up from his work. He slid an oiled rag down the barrel of the rifle, his focus intense. "Someone had to," he said, his voice a low murmur. "Many people would not have," she pressed gently. "They would have seen it as none off-tier business." He stopped his work then and looked at her. In the firelight, the gray of his eyes seemed to deepen, and she saw a flicker of something ancient and sorrowful in their depths. "This land is hard," he said. "It takes things from you. Sometimes all a person has left is their decency. It's not much, but it's something to hold on to." It was the most he had said to her at one time. It was a glimpse past the wall, a crack in the fortress. Emboldened, she asked another question. "What did it take from you?" He was silent for a long moment, his gaze lost in the dancing flames. She thought he would not answer, that she had pushed too far. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with an emotion he could not quite conceal. "I had a wife, Sarah, and a son, little Daniel. We had a small homestead east of here. The first 2 years were good." He paused, swallowing hard. Then the fever came through. It took them both in the space of a week. "I buried them on a Tuesday morning, under the cottonwood tree by the creek." He told the story in that same flat, practical tone he used for everything, but the pain was a living thing in the room, a palpable presence. Eleanor's heart ached for him. She saw him now not as a stern, unapproachable man, but as a man hollowed out by grief, a man who had walled himself off from the world to protect what was left of a shattered heart. "I am so sorry," she whispered, the words feeling hopelessly inadequate. He gave a short, bitter nod, as if accepting a fact he had long ago grown weary of. To her surprise, he then looked at her, his expression holding a question. "And you? What brings a woman from Boston to a place like Redemption?" It was a simple, direct question, and she answered it with the same raw honesty he had given her. She told him of her parents' death in a carriage accident, of her dwindling inheritance, of the loneliness and the quiet desperation that had led her to answer an advertisement for a mail-order bride. She spoke of the letters from Mr. Abernathy, letters filled with promises of a bright future, a shared life. "He seemed so kind in his letters," she finished, her voice thick with unshed tears. "He wrote of building a life here. He made it sound like a grand adventure." She gave a small, humorless laugh. "It seems the adventure was a lie. No one wanted me in Boston, and the man who was supposed to want me here doesn't even exist." The words hung in the air, a plain and painful admission of her own abandonment. Caleb set the rifle aside. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and for the first time, she did not feel like a burden or a problem he had to solve. She felt seen. "He was a fool then," Caleb said, his voice quiet but firm. To throw away the chance in that moment, by the fire, with the storm raging outside, a fragile bridge was built between them. They were two solitary souls, each marked by loss, who had shared their stories in the dark. The foundation of a new connection was laid, built not on pity, but on a shared understanding of grief and the quiet courage it took to survive it. The walls around Caleb Blackwood had not come down, but for the first time, a small gate had been opened, just a crack, letting in a sliver of light. The quiet rhythm of life on the ranch was shattered 2 weeks later. The first sign of trouble came not with a bang, but with a whisper. Caleb had ridden into Redemption for supplies, and when he returned, a thundercloud seemed to have settled on his brow. He was even more silent than usual during supper, his jaw set in a hard line. Later that evening, as Eleanor helped Martha clear the table, she overheard him talking to the older woman on the porch. His voice was a low, angry rumble. "It's Silas Croft," he said. "His men were in the saloon, asking questions. Asking about a new woman staying at my place, Croft." Martha spat the name like a curse. "That greedy old vulture. He's still after your land, isn't he?" "After the creek, he is," Caleb confirmed. "Sheriff Gable says Croft has been buying up every parcel of dry land around me. My stretch of Willow Creek is the only thing that makes any of it valuable. He thinks he can squeeze me out, and what does Miss Vance have to do with any of this? Martha asked. There was a long pause. I don't know, Caleb said, and the uncertainty in his voice chilled Eleanor more than his anger. But I don't like it. Croft isn't a man who leaves things to chance. Her arriving here, stranded, it feels connected somehow. The conversation ended, but a new tension had entered the house, a low hum of anxiety that settled over everything. The vast, open wilderness that had begun to feel like a comfort now seemed to hold a lurking menace. Eleanor felt a fresh wave of guilt. Had she brought this trouble to Caleb's door? Was her presence here putting him in danger? The threat escalated a few days later. Eleanor had taken to walking along the creek in the late afternoons, a quiet time for herself before starting supper. She loved the sound of the water, the way the cottonwood leaves shimmered in the breeze. She was gathering a small bouquet of wildflowers when she heard the sound of approaching horses. Two men rode out from a copse of aspens. They were rough-looking, with cruel mouths and eyes that appraised her with a cold, unsettling familiarity. Well, now, look what we have here, the first man said, his voice greasy. He dismounted, his spurs jingling. You must be the pretty little package that was supposed to be from Mr. Abernathy. Eleanor's blood ran cold. I don't know what you're talking about, she said, taking a step back, her hand clutching the wildflowers so tightly the stems bruised. The second man laughed, a harsh, grating sound. Oh, I think you do. See, our boss, Mr. Croft, he had an arrangement with this Abernathy fellow. An arrangement that involved you. But then Blackwood had to stick his nose in it. Mr. Croft doesn't like it when his plans get upset. The first man took another step toward her, his grin widening. He sent us to deliver a message. He wants you. Says you're part of the deal for the land. And he wants Blackwood to know that what belongs to Silas Croft stays with Silas Croft. Fear, sharp and blinding, seized Eleanor. She turned to run, but the man was too fast. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging in her flesh like talons. She cried out, struggling against his grip, but he was immensely strong. Suddenly, a voice cut through the air, cold and deadly as a shard of ice. Let her go. Caleb was there. He had appeared as if from the earth itself, standing 20 yards away, a rifle held loosely in his hands. He must have been returning from a north pasture. His face was a mask of controlled fury, his gray eyes narrowed to slits of granite. He had not raised his voice, but his quiet command held more menace than a shout. The man holding Eleanor hesitated, his eyes darting from Caleb to the rifle. This ain't your business, Blackwood. She's on my land. That makes her my business, Caleb said, his voice dangerously low. I'm going to say it one more time. Let her go. He raised the rifle slightly, the movement casual, but the implication was unmistakable. The second man, still on his horse, nudged his mount nervously. Come on, Jed. He ain't worth dying for. Jed glared at Caleb, his face contorted in a snarl. With a final, vicious shove, he threw Eleanor to the ground and remounted his horse. This ain't over, Blackwood, he spat. Croft gets what he wants. Always, the two men wheeled their horses around and galloped away, their laughter echoing back on the wind. Caleb was at her side in an instant, the rifle forgotten. He knelt, his hands hovering over her, unsure of where to touch. Are you hurt? He asked, his voice raw with a concern that stripped away all his usual reserve. Eleanor shook her head, pushing herself up. She was trembling, her arm throbbing where the man had grabbed her, but she was otherwise unharmed. No, I'm all right. You came. He helped her to her feet, his hands gentle on her elbows. For a moment, they stood there, the space between them charged with the aftermath of the confrontation. He had saved her. He had called her his business. In that terrifying moment, he had stood between her and the threat without a second's hesitation. His expression was grim. This changes things, he said, his gaze following the dust cloud of the departing riders. They won't stop. Croft is a snake. Once he's decided to strike, he doesn't back down. He looked back at her, and the protective fire in his eyes was fierce. You're not safe here anymore. His words hit her like a physical blow. You're not safe here anymore. He was going to send her away. Of course he was. She was a liability, a danger to him and his home. She had brought this darkness upon him. The thought of leaving, of being sent back out into the world alone, was more terrifying than the men had been. This place, this quiet ranch, this stern and silent man, they had become her haven. "Where will I go?" she whispered, the words catching in her throat. Caleb's jaw worked, a muscle flexing in his cheek. He looked away, toward the mountains, as if the decision pained him. "There's a stagecoach that leaves for Cheyenne on Friday. From there, you can get a train back east. I'll give you the money for the ticket." He said it brusquely, as if finalizing a business transaction. He was pushing her away, for her own protection. It was the only logical thing to do, but it felt like a betrayal. A chasm opened up between them, wider and deeper than the one that had existed when they were strangers. He was shutting the gate he had so briefly opened. He was retreating back into his fortress, and he was casting her out. She looked at his resolute, unforgiving profile, and her heart shattered like glass against stone. He had rescued her from Croft's men only to deliver a more devastating blow himself. He was sending her away, back to a world where no one wanted her. The 2 days leading up to the Friday stagecoach were filled with a strained, heartbreaking silence. The easy companionship that had begun to grow between them was gone, replaced by a formal, painful courtesy. Caleb avoided her, taking his meals quickly and spending all his time on the farthest reaches of the ranch. When their eyes did meet, his were shuttered and distant, revealing nothing of the turmoil she was sure must lie beneath. He was a man who had made a hard decision and was now enforcing it with brutal efficiency. Eleanor moved through her chores in a fog of misery. Every task was a farewell. Folding the laundry, she breathed in the clean, sun-drenched scent of Caleb's shirts for the last time. Gathering the eggs, she said a silent goodbye to the fussy hens. She helped Martha prepare meals she could barely bring herself to eat, the food tasting of ash in her mouth. She was losing the first place that had ever felt like home, and the loss was a physical ache in her chest. She understood his reasoning. He was a practical man, a man who dealt with threats in a direct and logical way. She was the target, the vulnerability. Removing her from the equation was the simplest way to neutralize the threat from Silas Croft. He was protecting her, and, in his own way, he was protecting himself from the danger she brought and perhaps from the feeling she stirred in him. But understanding did not ease the pain. It felt like a rejection, a final confirmation that she was, and always would be, an outsider, a piece of driftwood tossed from one shore to another. Martha watched the silent, miserable dance between them with sad, knowing eyes. On Thursday evening, as Eleanor was packing her small valise, the older woman came into her room. "He's a fool, you know," Martha said, her voice gentle but firm. "A stubborn, proud fool who thinks the only way to keep something safe is to lock it away or send it off. He learned the wrong lesson from his grief. He's trying to protect me," Eleanor said, her voice hollow as she folded a dress. "He's trying to protect himself," Martha corrected. "He's starting to care for you, child, and it terrifies him. Caring for someone means you could be hurt again. He'd rather face down Silas Croft and his whole pack of wolves than face that feeling. So he's pushing you away. It's the only way he knows how to fight." Martha's words offered a sliver of comfort, but it was a cold comfort. It didn't change the fact that in the morning she would be gone. She would climb into that stagecoach and ride out of his life, and he would return to his solitary existence. The walls of his fortress rebuilt, stronger and higher than before. That night, sleep would not come. The house was quiet, filled with the soft sounds of the wind and the ticking of the grandfather clock in the main room. Restless, Eleanor rose and went to the kitchen for a glass of water. As she passed the main room, she saw a figure silhouetted by the dying embers in the fireplace. It was Caleb. He was sitting in his chair, staring into the coals, a portrait of utter loneliness. She should have turned back, retreated to her room, but her feet would not move. She watched him for a long moment, this man who was both her savior and the source of her current heartbreak. She saw the tension in his shoulders, the deep sorrow in his posture. He was not a cold, unfeeling man. He was a man in profound pain, a man so afraid of adding a new loss to the old one that he would preemptively cut the ties himself. He must have sensed her presence, because he spoke without turning, his voice a low rasp in the darkness. "You should be sleeping. You have a long journey tomorrow." "I couldn't sleep," she said, stepping into the room. She stood a few feet behind his chair. "Caleb, is this truly what you want?" "What I want has nothing to do with it," he said, his voice hard. "It's what's necessary. Croft won't stop until he has what he wants. As long as you're here, you're in his line of fire. And what about you?" she challenged, her voice gaining strength. "You'll still be here. His fight is with you over this land. Me leaving doesn't solve that. It only removes one of his pawns. He will find another way to come at you. I can take care of myself," he said flatly. "I always have." The words, meant to reassure, felt like a slap. "Yes," she said, a bitter edge to her voice. "You and your solitude. Your fortress. You hide in it, don't you? You think it keeps you safe, but it's just a prison. You're not living, Caleb. You're just surviving." He stood then, turning to face her. In the dim, red glow of the embers, his face was a mask of shadows and harsh angles. "You know nothing about it. I know what it is to be alone," she cried, the words tearing from her throat, raw and full of a pain that mirrored his own. "I know what it is to feel that the world has no place for you. But I would rather face any danger with someone at my side than face a safe and empty life by myself. Is that what you want? To win this fight with Croft only to return to your silence, to this empty house?" Her words struck home. She saw it in the flicker of his eyes, in the sudden tension in his body. She had breached his defenses, hit the very core of his fear. They stood there, facing each other across the shadowed room, the air electric with unspoken emotions. The misunderstanding was laid bare. He thought he was protecting her, but she felt he was abandoning her, and in doing so, abandoning himself. Before he could answer, a sound from outside shattered the moment. The sharp, frantic barking of Zeke, the ranch dog. It was not his usual playful bark. It was a sound of alarm, high-pitched and urgent. It was cut off abruptly by a sickening yelp. Caleb's head snapped toward the window. His entire demeanor changed in an instant. The internal conflict vanished, replaced by the sharp, focused alertness of a man facing an immediate physical threat. "Get away from the windows," he ordered, his voice a low, urgent command. He moved swiftly to the wall, where his rifle and shotgun were mounted. "They're here." Silas Croft had not waited for Friday. The night erupted into chaos. The splintering crash of a window in the front room was followed by the roar of a shotgun. Caleb, already moving, shoved Eleanor toward the kitchen. "Stay down," he yelled, as he returned fire with his rifle, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. The smell of gunpowder filled the air, sharp and acrid. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the symphony of violence. Terror threatened to paralyze her, but the sight of Caleb, a lone figure standing against the assault, ignited something else within her, a fierce, protective rage. This was her home they were attacking. This was her life, the one she had just fought for with words, that they were trying to destroy. She would not be a helpless victim cowering in a corner. "The back!" Caleb shouted over the din of another gunshot. "They'll try the back door." While he kept the men in the front occupied, Eleanor scrambled through the kitchen. She saw the shadow of a man moving outside the kitchen window. Acting on pure instinct, she grabbed the heaviest object she could find, Martha's cast-iron skillet. As the back door began to splinter under the force of a heavy boot, she flattened herself against the wall beside it. The door burst open, and a large, bearded man lunged into the room. Before he could even register her presence, Eleanor swung the skillet with all her might, connecting with the side of his head with a sickening thud. The man grunted in surprise and crumpled to the floor in a heap. She stared down at him, her breath coming in ragged gasps, the heavy skillet still clutched in her hand. She had done that. The refined lady from Boston had felled a man with a piece of cookware. From the other room, she heard a cry of pain. Caleb! Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her adrenaline. She ran back in the main room to see him leaning against the wall, his left arm slick with blood. A bullet had grazed his bicep. He was trying to reload his rifle with one hand, his face pale, but set in a grim mask of determination. "I'm fine," he grunted, seeing her expression. "Just a scratch outside," a voice yelled. "He's hit. Let's burn him out." Eleanor saw the flicker of a torch being thrown toward the front porch. The drywood would catch in an instant. They were trapped. In that moment of stark terror, clarity descended upon her. She looked at Caleb, his face illuminated by the growing light of the flames outside, and knew she could not lose him. Martha's words echoed in her mind. "He's starting to care for you, child." And it terrifies him. He had tried to send her away to keep her safe, and now they were facing death together. "The ammunition," she said, her voice clear and steady. "Where is it?" He nodded toward a wooden chest near the fireplace. While he laid down covering fire, she ran to it, her movements quick and sure. She opened it and began pulling out boxes of cartridges, her fingers, once skilled at embroidery, now working to feed the instruments of their survival. She was no longer a damsel in distress. She was a partner in this fight. She loaded the spare shotgun, her hands surprisingly steady, and passed it to him. "The barn," Caleb said, his voice strained. "If we can make it to the barn, we'll have better cover." But the house was now surrounded, the flames licking up the front porch, casting dancing, demonic shadows into the room. There was no escape. It was then that Eleanor had an idea, a desperate, wild gamble. "The lamp oil," she said, pointing to the large can Martha kept for the kitchen lamps. A diversion. Caleb looked at her, his eyes questioning. But there was no time to argue. He saw the fierce resolve in her face, the intelligence in her eyes. He nodded. "What do you have in mind?" "They want to burn us out from the front," she said quickly, her mind racing. "If we set a fire at the back of the house on the far side, it might draw some of them away. They'll think we're trying to burn evidence or create a smokescreen to escape." It was a crazy risk, setting their own home on fire. But it was better than letting Croft's men do it. Caleb gave her a single, sharp nod of agreement. He would cover her. Under the hail of intermittent gunfire, Eleanor crawled back to the kitchen. She grabbed a pile of rags, soaked them in the lamp oil, and pushed them through the broken frame of the back door. Caleb laid down a volley of shots toward the front, drawing their attention. With a trembling hand, Eleanor struck a match and tossed it onto the oil-soaked rags. The fire caught with a whoosh, flames climbing the dry timber of the back wall. "Fire! They've set a fire at the back!" A voice shouted from outside, just as she had hoped. The gunfire from the front lessened as two of the men broke away to investigate the new blaze. It was the opening they needed. "Now," Caleb said, grabbing her hand. His grip was like iron. "We go for the barn." "Stay low." They burst out the side door into the smoky, chaotic night. The world was a hellish landscape of shadows and flame. They ran, hunched low, across the open ground between the house and the barn. A bullet whizzed past Eleanor's ear, so close she felt its heat. Caleb shoved her forward, putting his own body between her and the direction of the shot. They tumbled through the barn doors just as a volley of shots splintered the wood where they had been. Inside, the darkness was a temporary refuge. The air was thick with the familiar, comforting scent of hay and horses. But they were not safe yet. They could hear Croft's men regrouping, their angry shouts cutting through the night. Caleb leaned against the stall, breathing heavily, his wounded arm bleeding freely now. Eleanor tore a strip of cloth from her petticoat and began to bind his wound, her movements gentle but efficient. He watched her, his face a mixture of pain, shock, and something else, something she had never seen there before. "Aw, you were incredible," he breathed, his voice filled with disbelief. "I am not a delicate thing, Caleb," she said softly, tying off the makeshift bandage. "I told you, I would rather fight beside you than be sent away to safety." They were cornered in the barn, the house they had both called home burning behind them, with a band of ruthless men outside. And yet, in that moment, the emotional distance between them had been completely erased. The fire had burned away his reserve, and the fight had revealed her strength. A heavy boot kicked to the barn door. Nowhere left to run, Blackwood. It was Jed's voice. Caleb raised his rifle, his jaw tight. He looked at Eleanor, his gray eyes blazing with a fierce, protective light in the flickering gloom. The fear of losing her, a fear he had been running from for weeks, was now a tangible, roaring beast in his chest. He had almost lost her tonight. He had tried to push her away, and in doing so had nearly consigned them both to this fate. He had been a fool, a stubborn, prideful fool, just as Martha had said. "Eleanor," he said, his voice thick with an emotion so powerful it seemed to shake his entire frame. "If we get out of this," he stopped, his throat working. "No, when we get out of this. I was wrong. I was so wrong." He reached out, his good hand cupping her cheek, his thumb stroking her skin. It was the first time he had touched her with such tenderness. "I spent 6 years building walls to keep the world out, to keep feelings out. I thought solitude was strength. But seeing you tonight, fighting for this place, for me, I've been a prisoner in a fortress of my own making. Being alone isn't strength. It's just being alone. The thought of my life without you in it, it's more terrifying than anything Silas Croft can throw at us." Tears streamed down Eleanor's face, mingling with the soot and grime. She leaned into his touch, her heart swelling with a love so fierce it left her breathless. "Caleb," she whispered. "I love you." "Eleanor Vance," he said, the words a raw, desperate confession torn from the very depths of his soul. "I love your courage and your strength and the way you see the world. I don't want to survive alone anymore. I want to live with you." Just as the barn door began to splinter, the sound of more gunfire erupted, but this time it was from behind Croft's men. A new voice yelled out, "This is Sheriff Gable. Throw down your weapons." Martha, bless her soul, must have seen the approaching riders from her window and slipped out the back during the initial chaos to ride for help. The tables had turned. Croft's men, caught between Caleb in the barn and the sheriff's posse outside, were thrown into confusion. The fight was short and decisive. As the sounds of surrender and shouted commands filled the night, Caleb pulled Eleanor into his arms. He held her tightly against him, his face buried in her hair, breathing her in as if she were the very air he needed to live. The barn was safe. They were safe. The external threat was over, but the internal battle had just been won. Amid the smoke and ruin of his old life, Caleb Blackwood had finally, irrevocably, chosen a new one. In the aftermath, the ranch was a scene of controlled chaos. Sheriff Gable and his deputies rounded up Croft's men, including Silas Croft himself, who had been foolishly directing the assault from nearby. Martha fussed over Caleb's arm, clucking her tongue as she properly cleaned and bandaged the wound, all the while casting proud, knowing glances at Eleanor. Neighbors, drawn by the glow of the fire, began to arrive, offering help and support. The community that Caleb had held at arm's length was now rallying around him, their faces etched with concern and friendship. The ranch house was a loss. The fire, started at both ends, had consumed it, leaving only the stone chimney standing like a lonely tombstone against the dawn sky. Eleanor and Caleb stood together, watching the last of the embers die down, the air thick with the smell of wet, charred wood. Everything they had shared within those walls, the quiet meals, the firelit conversations, the unspoken feelings, was gone. Eleanor felt a pang of loss, but it was overshadowed by a profound sense of peace. She looked at Caleb, who was watching the ruin of his home with a strangely serene expression. "It's just a building," he said, as if reading her thoughts. He turned to her, his good arm wrapping around her shoulders, pulling her close. "A home is not the walls that surround you. It's the person you share your life with." I almost learned that too late. He looked down at her, his gray eyes clear and filled with a love that was as vast and certain as the Wyoming sky. "I meant what I said in the barn. Eleanor, I know," she whispered, her heart full. He reached into the pocket of his waistcoat and pulled out a small, tarnished silver ring, intricately carved with tiny vines. It was delicate and old-fashioned. "This was my grandmother's," he said, his voice husky. "She gave it to my mother, who gave it to Sarah." He paused, the name no longer a ghost, but a gentle memory. "It represents the past, all the love that came before, He held her gaze, his own unwavering. I wanted to represent the future, too. Our future. A new life, built from the ashes of the old 1 inch. He took her left hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her own. Eleanor Vance, will you marry me? Will you build a new home with me? Right here? Tears of joy blurred her vision. This was it, the real promise. Not the lies in a letter from a phantom, but a heartfelt proposal from a man of substance and honor, a man she loved with every fiber of her being. She was not a pawn in a land deal or an abandoned mail-order bride. She was a woman who was chosen, who was loved. She had found her place. Yes, she said, her voice choked with emotion. Oh, Caleb. Yes, he slid the ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. He leaned down and kissed her then, a kiss that was not born of desperation or fear, but of profound love and unwavering commitment. It was a promise of shared dawns, of quiet evenings, of laughter to fill the silence, of a life built together, nail by nail, fence post by fence post. The town of Redemption embraced their story. Silas Croft was sent to the territorial prison, his land empire crumbling under the weight of his crimes. The community, led by Sheriff Gable, organized a barn raising, or in this case, a house raising. Neighbors for miles around came with lumber, tools, and food. They worked from sunup to sundown, and in the space of a week, the frame of a new, larger house stood on the foundation of the old one. Eleanor and Caleb were married a month later in the small-town church. The entire town attended. Martha wept openly, and Sheriff Gable stood as Caleb's best man. Eleanor wore a simple cream-colored dress she and Martha had sewn, and in her hair she wore a sprig of lavender from the garden. As she walked down the aisle toward Caleb, who stood waiting for her with an expression of such love and adoration it took her breath away, she knew she had never been more certain of anything in her life. This was her home. This was her family. This was where she belonged. 2 years later, the Wyoming sun, a gentler morning version of its fierce afternoon self, streamed through the large glass window of the new ranch house. The window had been Eleanor's idea, a feature that Caleb had initially deemed impractical, but had built for her without complaint. It looked out over the valley, toward the silver ribbon of Willow Creek and the majestic, unchanging peaks of the Laramie Mountains. The house itself was a testament to their partnership, solid and practical like Caleb, warm and filled with light like Eleanor. A small, chubby-fingered hand smeared jam on that very window pane. Dada, a little voice chirped. Eleanor laughed, lifting her 1-year-old son, Daniel, onto her hip. He had his father's dark hair, but her violet-blue eyes. Yes, that's Dada, she said, pointing toward the corrals. Caleb was working with a young colt, his movements patient and sure, a language of quiet confidence that the horse seemed to understand perfectly. He looked up, as if sensing their gaze, and a slow, easy smile spread across his face. He waved, and little Daniel waved back with a clumsy, enthusiastic fist. Life was full. It was a richness Eleanor could never have imagined in her lonely room in Boston. It was in the weight of her son in her arms, in the comforting presence of Martha humming in the kitchen, in the feel of the rich soil of her garden under her fingertips. She was expecting their second child in the autumn, a fact that was a quiet, joyful secret still shared only between her and Caleb. The ranch was thriving. Their cattle herd had doubled, and the silence that Caleb had once used as a shield was now a peaceful quiet, comfortably filled with the sounds of a growing family. That evening, after Daniel was asleep in his crib and Martha had retired for the night, Eleanor and Caleb sat together on the porch swing he had built for her. The air was cool and smelled of pine and damp earth. A million stars were scattered across the impossibly dark sky. Caleb's arm was warm and solid around her, his hand resting gently on the slight swell of her stomach. "Do you remember that first night?" she asked softly, leaning her head against his shoulder. "In the old house, during the storm?" He nodded, his cheek resting against the top of her head. "I remember everything about that night. I remember you asking me what this land had taken from me, and I told you that no one wanted me," she murmured, the memory no longer holding any pain, only a distant echo of a woman she barely recognized. He turned her face toward his thumb gently tracing the line of her jaw. His gray eyes, once so guarded and stormy, were now the calm, clear color of a peaceful dusk, reflecting the starlight and his deep, abiding love for her. "I wanted you then, Eleanor," he said, his voice a low, sincere rumble. "I was just too much of a fool to know it." He leaned in and kissed her, a soft, lingering kiss that spoke of shared history and a boundless future. "I want you now, and I want you for all the days to come. You and Daniel, and this little one right here. You're my home. You are everything." She smiled against his lips, her heart overflowing. The abandoned girl from Boston and the solitary cowboy had found more than just a new life. They had found the entire world in each other, a love as strong and enduring as the mountains that watched over them, a home built not of timber and stone, but of unwavering devotion.